Hello again, it's Lawrence Casey from the UQ Careers. We're here today to discuss your final piece of assessment, which is the online interview, which you will be recording. In terms of what today is going to be about, it's more about looking towards your genuine interviews, looking at what you should be doing when you're moving into the workforce. But I'll also spend a fair bit of time at the end of today's workshop to give you some feedback and give you some basic clarification around the particular assessment. So this workshop really is about the interview process as a whole, not necessarily just about this assignment. So before we go into the crux of today's workshop, I want you to have a think about understanding your approach in terms of when you are job searching. It's really important that you take heed of the other work that you've been doing throughout semester and looking towards that whole networking and making sure that you are connecting whilst you're on internships. Obviously, the non-competitive approach is doing the whole networking process and making sure that you are meeting people, that you are introducing yourself, that you're sending out approach letters, that you are looking for opportunities that may not be advertised, because that competitive approach is what everyone else is going to be doing. It's not just your cohort, but cohorts across the university. They wait for a job to be, students will wait for a job to be advertised, and then everyone applies for it. So quite often you could be potentially applying for a job that a couple of hundred other people will be going for as well. So in terms of that, I would well and truly encourage you to start that networking process now and make sure that you're really getting involved in that as soon as possible. In terms of before the job search process, we've got you to set up a LinkedIn profile. I want you to continue on working on that, particularly coming into graduation time, where obviously employers will be looking at your online social media presence, particularly your LinkedIn profile. So if you have set and forget since you've submitted that assignment previously, I would encourage you to jump back online, have a look at it, see if you can update it, even by updating some of the new skills and maybe the new experiences that you've had since you first originally did it from your internship as well. In terms of the interviews that you are likely to be subjected to, and I say subjected to because not everyone loves them, there's quite a few that many employers tend to adopt. Generally speaking, within Australia, it's the behavioural interview that we are expected to do most of the time. So today's workshop will be looking at, I guess, the characteristics of those interviews, but also looking at how they incorporate other types of interview strategies and techniques as well. In terms of the slide that's sitting in front of you now with the different types of interviews, the structured interview is exactly that. They'll ask you the same questions. It's really hard to score applicants if you're asking them different types of questions, and they'll have a unified set of probably about 8 or 9 interview questions that they will have to go through as part of the screening process. So that's what a structured interview is. The behavioural interview is what I was talking about earlier, where they'll talk about past experiences, how you discuss your skills. Quite often it will be, tell me about a time when, and we'll discuss that a bit later on as well, where you're expected to use that STAR formula and talk about that experience in a really structured manner to hopefully articulate all the skills that you actually use in that situation. With the screening interview, it's something that we don't do so much anymore because it's time intensive. Obviously the touch points that an employer wants to have with you in the recruitment process, they're going to be trying to keep that to a minimum. So they don't want to be calling people back, then calling you back in for an interview. So in terms of that screening process, quite often now it's a test that they make you do online. Before you even submit an application, many employers will say, right, before we even meet with you, sit this test. That can be anything from like an aptitude test. So if any of you have done IQ tests in the past, or maybe even some of the QCS tests is not too far in the past for you. Some of those interview questions based on the screening tests that they encourage you to do online will be very, very similar. So quite often with those screening interviews, they will be psychometric testing, numeracy, literacy, interpretation, looking at graphs, looking at patterns, those sorts of things. And if you get, sometimes I'll set a minimum that you'll need to score before you're actually brought back in for an interview. Sometimes that's sort of 80%. That's the screening process. Obviously, when they're putting out their 4 applications, they're trying to minimise the amount of time their HR people are taken offline. So if they can get a computer program to do that for them, it saves them a hell of a lot of time. And then they can focus on actually meeting you face to face and getting to know you a bit later on once they've got it down to a manageable number. In terms of the panel interview, most of you will go through that process. It's very unlikely, unless it's a very informal interview, where that you won't be interviewed by at least 3 people. So with a panel interview, it's usually a direct line supervisor, someone that might be doing your job, and then also maybe the senior manager of that particular division, or sometimes if you're really unlucky, it's the CEO of the organisation sitting in. In terms of that panel interview, quite often the people themselves don't have a vested interest in those particular questions, so they haven't written those questions. Generally speaking, right before the interview, they will say, you ask the first 3, you ask the second 3, and then I'll ask the final. So they don't have a they haven't actually written those questions themselves. It's just part of the process. So when you are involved in those panel interviews, make sure that you address the whole group. You don't just want to talk to the one person that's asked you that question and then exclude all the others. Generally speaking, the person that's actually doing your job that might be on that panel, their opinion tends to matter the most because they know exactly what is needed to actually do that job well. And they will have the most influence in terms of whether they think you articulated yourself well in that interview or not. And it's their opinion is obviously probably the most weighty of the bunch in the panel interview setup. In terms of the group interview, I think in your industry you probably won't have to do it, but it is something that many industries are starting to include. With the group interviews, if any of you have decided to sit through reality, try and get on reality TV, quite often they put you through these group scenarios. They can be really basic, so in terms of you've crash landed on a deserted island, they put you in a group of 10 people, you've got items that you need to figure out which ones you want to take and why, and then they just set you and say you've got 10 minutes and you need to decide what you want to take and why, and they watch the group dynamics and take notes and psychoanalyze you and those sorts of things as well. Generally speaking in your area, because it is the industry that is and is very focused on your people skills, networking skills, they will probably want to see you one-on-one. But if you are going to some of the top sort of firms like KPMG and Deloitte in a comms role or something like that, don't be surprised if you are actually called in for a group interview, and sometimes they're called assessment centres. So if you have heard that term around, it's a group interview. In terms of the telephone interview, be careful with these because you can be caught off guard. Most HR people will call you just to invite you in for an interview and say, hey, congratulations, you've been successful, we'd like you to come in for an interview. Some people have had that happen to them so much that it just becomes commonplace where they say, have you got a few minutes to talk? And people automatically say yes. Then they're caught off guard because they're actually asked quite in-depth and detailed interview questions on the phone. I've seen many people fall to pieces when that actually happens because they may be on a bus or walking down the street or just going into a lecture or something like that. In terms of that telephone interview process, if someone says to you, do you have a few minutes to talk? Either say, no, can I give you a call back? When I'm just about to go into a lecture or I'm just about to get on the bus with a bazillion grade 9 high school students running around the back of the bus. You need to be able to get yourself somewhere where you can settle, focus, that you're not distracted by noise or other things going on. But if you do get that interview via the phone, you need to be able to concentrate on your answers. So if you're not able to do that, I would try and buy some time. Make sure before you get off the phone to them, you have their name, their contact details, that means their phone number, and I would potentially ask for a mobile as well, just in case when you go to call them back, you can't get hold of them. In terms of the video interview, which is what you are going to be doing for this particular assignment, it's something that's definitely well and truly in the recruitment processes in many organisations. It's a way for them to streamline their processes. It's a way that they can do it in their own time. They can watch as many or as little as they want to. And it really helps them, I guess, streamline that process in terms of they have set questions. You've got a set amount of time to answer those questions, and they can set them through their HR department and get a couple of people to watch a few, and it just helps share the load as well. So with those video interviews, they're actually something that's becoming pretty common in most industries. So I wouldn't be surprised if you're actually asked to do something similar in your own industry. With them, quite often they'll give you a login to a website. You log in, it'll have a bit of a brief description as to the requirements of the interview and what to expect. Then there'll be a go button or a start button, and you press that. The first interview question will pop up for about 30 seconds. You're given that time to think about your answer to that question, and then it just starts recording automatically for 2 minutes. You don't get to replay it, you don't get to look at it again, it just stops recording and then rolls on to the next question. So do be mindful, you need to hit the ground running with those online video interviews, because it's not something that you can pace yourself. The program that you're logging into sets the pace, so you really need to be able to make sure that you have some good solid answers and some scenarios to talk about as well. In terms of the informal interview, can be really, really tricky, because you're not really sure if it's going to be informal or not. It could be in a cafe. It's happened to me a couple of times where I've gone into what I thought was an informal interview, and I've walked in and the person that thought I was meeting solo has brought in managers or this CEO or a business partner and said, hey, they were in the office, they thought they'd come down and meet you as well. It's really important that if you are doing that, that you make sure you're aware of the expectations. So will it just be you and I? Are you expecting anyone else to be joining us? What coffee shop, so you can get an idea of how busy it's going to be and how potentially noisy and distracting it's going to be as well. So do be mindful of that, because informal interviews, particularly in your industry, once you start getting into a couple of years experience, I wouldn't be surprised if you are just meeting people for coffee, and that does in itself turn into an interview. So do keep that in mind. In terms of preparation, I think it's really important that we all doing preparation, but I want you to think about what you've done in the past or what you haven't done in the past, which is what many students think about. They quite regularly go to interviews sight unseen, which I would never, ever suggest that you do. But I think when you're going for these professional interviews, quite often for you, it might be the first professional interview you've ever done, apart from maybe your cafe job or something like that as well. So in terms of preparation, it's really important that you are pretty clear with what you do, and make sure you get into a routine of what prep that you do when you go for a particular job as well. In terms of what we would suggest, definitely research the company. Every organisation wants to hire someone that only wants to work for them and knows about who they are, what they've done, and I guess what they do well and what they're known for. So it's not a matter of a quick 5-second look at their website. Don't just look at their values page. You need to sort of pull it apart. You need to find out who's working there, how long they've been there for, what their background is. Generally speaking, if you are called in for an interview, you're completely within your rights to ask who's going to be involved and what role do they play within the organisation, because that then allows you to go do some professional stalking online and have a look at their LinkedIn profile, because it's good for your psychology going into an interview, feeling like you know someone. So it's really important that you have done a little bit of social media profiling of the interviewers as well, because they will be doing it to you. They will be looking at your social media. They will be looking at any online portfolios or blogs that you may have created, those sorts of things as well. So do your due diligence. A lot of people say and have expressed concerns around it being a little bit creepy to be looking at people's social media profiles. LinkedIn, remember, that's what it's there for. So I would suggest that if I'm recruiting for someone and I see that they're looking at my profile, I think that's a good thing, because it shows that they're doing their due diligence, that they're doing some research, and they're actually really investing time to try to nail the interview process anyway. So make sure that you have a look at maybe current campaigns, past campaigns, any mergers that they may have been involved in, just information about the company and where their maybe strategic direction is. Quite often on their company websites, they will actually have annual reports and projections and things that may be happening in the future as well. And it might be those future things that you're really, really interested in, not just necessarily what they may have done in the past. It could be something exciting that's coming up that's really tweaked your interest and made you want to apply for them as well. So Be comfortable talking about yourself, because it is your only time to shine in terms of the interview process. I would say that interviews are almost 75 to 80% of the recruitment process. We all know people that have gotten jobs they probably shouldn't have got for their ability to talk and their ability to articulate themselves. So the way that you engage and the way that you sell your skills and articulate your abilities, I think is really, really important. So for those of you that are, and it's a cultural thing, we don't like talking ourselves up, we don't like talking about ourselves in a positive light. We find it a lot easier to find and discuss what we don't do well rather than what our strengths are and what we do well. But you need to look at both sides of the fence. So when you're looking at, I guess, information and talking about yourself in the interview process, look at key situations that you've been in, particularly while you've been on prac or on placement. What you've done well in those instances, look at some of your strengths, what are some of your weaknesses as well. It's really important to know that, and we'll talk about that a bit later on as well. But also prepare for common interview questions. We all know from a basic Google search you should be able to find common interview questions, and they're the ultimate levelers in terms of every industry you're going to go in is going to ask you a question that's something like, tell me about yourself. Tell me about a time when, how do you work in team environments, what do you think some of your strengths are? So they're all the basic ones that you can actually come up with answers well and truly in advance. Don't practice them too much, because then it sounds like you're remembering a script, and that's not what you want to sound like when you're actually doing an interview. And it's what actually many students sound like when they're doing the video interview, because they've had time to rack their brains and come up with almost a script, and it becomes more about you remembering content rather than the engagement, because it's very easy to fall into the trap of talking to a computer screen and forgetting that people are going to watch it. So you need to make sure that you're really focused on staying interesting, using your intonation in your voice, using hand movements, those sorts of things. Don't just sit slumped in your chair. It's very easy to fall into that trap when you're actually doing online interviews, where you're not talking to anyone at the other end. Also, you need to conduct practice interviews, and I would suggest you do that with friends and family. Don't do the whole sitting in front of a mirror, talking to yourself, because you become too conscious or subconscious about what you're doing with your face, or maybe there's a blemish on your skin and that's something that you kind of focus on. Do it with your friends and family, because they don't really care what you say. They could be playing with their phone, they could be watching My Kitchen Rules, then they're not really focused on you. So therefore, you adopt a more casual approach. And I will say with all honesty, 9 times out of 10, that casual confidence is a lot more impressive than over-prepared and stiff and scripted, definitely. It seems really, really obvious, but make sure you find out where your interview will be. I think the biggest killer of pre-interview prep, and also the initiation of anxiety before an interview, is feeling rushed beforehand. So it seems really common knowledge, but make sure you find out where you need to be, what the parking's all about. Is it paid for? Do you need to have a credit card? It seems really, really basic, but make sure you do your homework even with that sort of thing as well. Some buildings can be like rabbit warrens, so it's very easy to get lost or get out on wrong floors. And the last thing you want to do is walk into an interview really flustered because you feel you're running late. In terms of what to do just before an interview, don't rock up really, really early. One of the key issues with that is you never know who's going to be in the waiting room with you. It could be your competition. It is very easy to fall into the trap of psychoanalyzing that person and psyching yourself out in that process as well, particularly if you're silly enough to engage with them and have a conversation where you find out all their experience and then you start doubting your own experiences and those sorts of things as well. So I would suggest, look, get there early, maybe 20 minutes, but then maybe sit somewhere, settle yourself, calm yourself, do whatever you need to do to make sure you're not stressing too much. And then 10-15 minutes before the interview is supposed to start, I would then sort of walk into the building or walk into the escalator as well. Just remember that the interview starts as soon as you walk into an organisation. For those of you that may have had admin roles or have parents in admin roles, the admin person are the key gatekeepers to any business. They're the first point of contact for pretty much anyone coming in or calling the office, so their opinion does matter. and you'd be really surprised how open and honest they are with criticism of people that have come in, and how they've been dealt with, or whether they even had eye contact made with them, or they seemed really disengaged and not really made any conscious effort to engage with the admin person at all. So do keep that in mind as well. Be really mindful of your body language, and I think this is where I think it's important to think as interviewers a bit like a performance, and the whole saying fake it till you make it. You may feel so nervous that it's almost killing you, but once you get into that interview room, you need to make sure that you're on, that the performance is happening, and that all comes through in your body language and the way that you use your non-verbals. So obviously the way that you're sitting, the way that you're holding your hands, what you're doing with your legs, whether you're leaning forward, whether you're leaning back, all those sorts of things. So there's a couple of examples that are on the body language slide, and I think about that one on the top, the bottom right side, and I call that the Wolf of Wall Street pose, where you think you're going to take over the office. So be careful that if you are trying to keep calm and try and be casual, sometimes you can take that a bit too far. So don't lounge in your chair. Make sure that you are maintaining some positive body language, because it's those sorts of non-verbal cues that really irk interviewers, and it's something that they will judge quite quickly. Before you even start talking, they will see how you hold yourself. Particularly even when you walk into a room and when you're introducing yourself, even the handshake. A lot of employers will actually stand back just to see how confident you are, whether you walk up to them and approach them to shake their hand. So do bear that in mind. I make a conscious effort now whenever I meet people to put my hand out first before they even get a chance. So in the interview process as well, it's really important that eye contact is kept as well. You can tell when people are starting to lose their confidence or starting to panic when their eyes start darting around the room and they're looking at random people and not really focusing on answering the question. So with that eye contact, make sure that you are treating it a bit like you would a university presentation where you're scanning the room and talking to everyone. Like I said, you don't want to focus in on one person or who you think is the most important person in that room, because everyone else will become disengaged. So you need to make sure that you are talking to everyone as well. One of the key things that we tend to do when we're nervous is speak very, very quickly. And I think it's important that you take the time to slow yourself down and pace yourself. I think it's when we are nervous and keeping our speech rapidly or rapid, we tend to get a bit muddled as to our thought processes and what we're actually trying to say. So it's really important that you make a conscious effort to slow down when you talk. When you start seeing people's eyes starting to wander, you then should start realising that you're losing them. And if they're looking down at their paper and it doesn't look like they're writing any notes, I think it's time to maybe stop talking or maybe wait for the next question to be asked as well. One of the key things is to think before you speak, and by that I mean you need to process the question first. You need to make sure that you've interpreted it the way that it needed to be interpreted. It becomes very apparent to an interviewee when you're starting to answer the wrong question, because you can see their faces change and you're quite clearly giving them an answer they weren't looking for. If you don't understand the question that's being asked, or if you're not really sure what key details they're looking for, you can seek clarification. Look, I'm not really sure what you're talking about. Do you mind rephrasing the question? Or, there's two ways I could take this possible answer. I'm just wondering whether you're after this or whether you're after this. Which one are you wanting me to articulate more? Ask for clarification. It saves you going down the wrong path, and it saves them from saying, I'm sorry, you've got the wrong end of the stick. This is what we're really looking for. Because if they have to do that, it kills your flow. It potentially kills your confidence, because you'll be sitting there thinking, oh, I bombed that question. So make sure you seek clarification if you don't understand the question. Also, particularly around that question that may be asked about your weaknesses, you need to turn those negatives into positives. You don't ever want to just throw out a negative and leave it there to be judged. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. You don't want to talk about yourself If they ask you a question, you don't want to turn that around and say, I'm sorry, I haven't really had experience in that, or I don't have much working knowledge of that. You can actually sort of deadbat those type of questions by saying, look, I haven't had experience in that particular scenario, but something similar that I have been involved in previously is this, and then you can kind of shift the direction of that question. Also, you need to avoid one-word answers. If you're in and out of an interview within 10 minutes or 15 minutes, you probably haven't said enough or given them enough content to make a proper judgment on whether you're suitable for the role. So do keep that in mind. You need to make sure that you are giving full answers that are skill-based, that are potentially selling your abilities. So please be careful of giving too shorter responses. Also, you really need to show passion for the role. So with that should come through with your research. Obviously, you should not be applying for places that you don't know anything about, that you're not really interested in working for. So if you do or are going for a role that you're really keen on, generally that should come through anyway, because you're actually really excited about the role. But sometimes you want that role so badly that you get really nervous, and that can come across as really disengaged because you're just trying to control your nerves. So you need to sort of make sure you keep that balance as well. So typical interview questions. The first one is, tell me about yourself. And it could be worded exactly like that, or is there anything that you would like to tell us about your previous background? So it's a really open-ended question, and I think a lot of people struggle with that question because they're not really sure what to say, how much detail to give, whether they should give personal information, should they keep it professional. I would suggest always take the latter, so take it to a professional level. Don't say that you like long walks on the beach, that you come from a family that lived in the country, that you've got 6 brothers and you collect dogs and those sorts of things. They don't really want to know that information. Tell me about yourself is, I guess, key milestones, experiences that have led to where you are today. So why you chose your study area, what have you enjoyed about your study area, discuss some of your experiences in that area and what you've really, really liked. Was there any key influential people that has influenced you along the way, or maybe even influenced you before you chose your study area? So a lot of people, a lot of young students are influenced by maybe teachers or caregivers or parents or whatever. Particularly I've noticed in the care industries, quite often nurses from families of medical professionals, whether mum was a nurse or dad was a nurse or doctors and those sorts of things. So generally speaking, we do have influences in our lives that put us on a path of where we are. Also, why should we hire you for the role? And I think that's a tricky question because that's purely about you selling yourself. And I think if you have nailed your elevator pitch that we discussed the last 2 workshops, then you should be okay because you've already reflected on what your skills are, what you do well. The one thing in interview setting is you need to try and tie that back to the role. So not just talk about your skills, but how that adds value to the role. Particularly in your selection criteria, you've already done that. So you should be able to draw on some of those examples that you gave and pull that into your interview and pretty much just extrapolate out or add more value or more detail to your selection criteria questions for that type of question. Also, why you want to work for them. Again, it comes through in your research that you've done previously. Strengths and weaknesses. Now, I think your weaknesses one is the potentially fatal question that you may get. Please don't say that you're a perfectionist. It's a horrendous answer to give, and it's, I don't think, truly honest. Quite often, if you're a perfectionist, your time management is horrible because you get caught up on the details and forget about the big picture because you're just too busy focusing on those details. So if you're going to say perfectionism, think about it. So does it affect your productivity? Does it affect your time management? Be reflective on how that has potentially affected you in the past, and make sure that you've got some strategies that you've potentially implemented to overcome those as well. So with your weaknesses, they don't want to use that as a screening tool. So they're not saying, give us some weaknesses so we can make a judgment on you. What they're wanting to do is for you to acknowledge that you aren't perfect, to have enough insight into your own behaviours that you can pinpoint something that you need to work on, that you can be progress driven and look to improving those weaknesses. So you need to have a look at strategies or what you've done to improve on those weaknesses, and then potentially some results. So maybe you've identified a weakness in meeting new people or engaging with stakeholders or something like that. Maybe it's like a confidence thing, dealing with new people. Some strategies that I would suggest that you could possibly do: public speaking courses, Toastmasters, or maybe you've just taken an active approach to meeting new people. Maybe you've joined a club, those sorts of things, just to improve your social awareness and social confidence. Therefore, that's obviously going to affect your skills with engaging colleagues and engaging external stakeholders, those sorts of things. So they're really looking for an approach where you're looking to improve, and have started to do that. Now, the salary expectations question is a tricky one. With you, obviously, research should have told you that it's 50 plus, 55 plus. Don't price yourself out by saying that you're worth $90,000 as a new grad, because you probably won't get a job. But generally speaking, they won't ask those particular questions, particularly straight out of university. In terms of structuring your answers, it's really important to focus on the STAR formula. So it's exactly the same one that you should have used for your last assignment, so answering the selection criteria. It's just verbalising it, pretty much. Generally speaking, interview questions don't deviate too much from the selection criteria. It may be worded differently, or it may look or seek to find a bit more information about the key selection criteria that they originally put in the advert that you've been looking at. So make sure that when you are answering interview questions, you follow that STAR formula: situation, task, action, result. And that's all around those behavioural type questions. So at the start of the workshop, I discussed the behavioural interview. Quite often it'll be those questions: tell me about a time when, can you discuss a time or a moment that you've had to blah, how have you worked in teams, can you provide an example of how you've shown leadership, or something like that. Generally speaking, they can be very easily answered by using that STAR formula and following through that whole approach. Our service does offer assistance with structuring and formulating answers to interview questions. I'm not sure whether you may have the ability or the time to book in for appointments to see us for that, but definitely it's worth your while to even do that as a general prep for when you're about to graduate anyway. Also, it's really important come time at the end of the interview that you've actually got questions prepared. You don't want to have that really awkward ending to an interview where they say, do you have any questions for us? And you say, not at the moment. That sort of gives the impression that you're potentially going to call them back after the process is done and say, well, hang on, I've got a question and this is it. Always have key questions that you would like to be asked, or that you would like to ask. Generally speaking, the 3 questions that are on the PowerPoint slide that you should be looking at now, they're questions that you can actually ask no matter what industry you end up. So, what are the key performance indicators for someone in this role in the first 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, whatever? Because quite often they may have you nailed for a particular project that's obviously not in the job ad. So they might say, well, we've got this new project coming up, blah, blah, blah. So if that feeds into some of your skills or strengths, you could actually then say, oh wow, okay, that sounds awesome. I've had these particular experiences. I'm doing something similar while I'm on placement, those sorts of things. So you can actually it actually helps you sell your skills. Also, maybe asking something about the company or something about someone's experiences. I saw while I was doing some prep before the interview, I noticed that you had recently worked on this particular campaign, and then maybe ask them a question about that campaign, because it's something that's a common denominator. So you may have an interest in something that's in common with someone on the interview panel, and you want to show also that you've done some research. Also, the final question I think is really, really important. And it's something that I myself have asked pretty much every interview that I've ever been in for the last 10 years. It was given to me by an old recruiter friend of mine. And it's, what was it about my application that you think would add value to the position? And I think that's an important question to ask, because you don't know necessarily why you're sitting there or why you've been shortlisted for that interview. Generally speaking, if you've been asked in for an interview, you're one of probably about 8, maybe, depending on the size of the organisation. So generally speaking, they interview sort of 8 people. You want to know why you're there and why you're sitting in front of them, because they've chosen you for a reason. Obviously, that's a fairly unique reason. You want to find out what that is. one of the key reasons you want to find that out is then you can sell it back to them. Because it might have been some sort of experience that you've mentioned in your selection criteria, and they may say, look, you were here because you've had experience in generating content and in putting together short films that we've seen on your blog, and then you can actually sell it back to them. Well, to tell you a bit more about that, blah, 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 and you can actually sort of turn it into a bit more of a conversation, but also you're selling back something that's already sold you to them. So you're just giving them more information and I guess more strength for them to hire you. After the interview process, it's really, really important that you reflect on what went well. For your own sanity, also for your self-improvement when you're going forward for other interviews as well. You shouldn't go into an interview expecting that you're going to get it. I would see an interview process as a learning experience every time that needs to be refined. Unless you have God-given and were born with amazing skills in terms of engagement and those sorts of things, well, let's face it, a lot of the comm students are those people. That's why you've ended up in this particular degree. I think it's really important that you reflect, I guess, on what those key areas of the interview were that didn't go so well, that what you should have improved or what you can improve. Also focusing on what points hit the mark. Because when you ask for feedback at the end of your interview, if you're bold enough to do that, or maybe when they give you a call back, or maybe when you follow up, you can always ask about what they thought you need to improve on, or what they thought went well. But also, if there's particular questions that you felt that you struggled with, you can actually then say to them on the phone and invite negative, positive criticism, I guess, that, I've struggled on this particular question. I'm just wondering whether I may have not given you exactly what you're looking for. I just wanted to seek clarification of what sort of answer I probably should have been looking at, because I'm always looking to improve my interview skills. I'm just wanting to make sure that I can make the best of this experience as well. If you don't invite constructive criticism, they won't give it to you. And I think it's really important that you always seek feedback at the end of any interview process, particularly if you didn't get it. Because if you ask for just general feedback, that you'll be given the really condescending answer. Look, it was a really tight panel this year. We had a lot of applicants that had a great deal of experience. You just didn't quite have what we're looking for. Those sort of answers aren't helpful to you. They don't give you anything to reflect on. They don't give you anything to improve. So definitely, if you're asking for feedback, you need to be specific, because they're not going to give it to you otherwise. Because they're HR people. They're not there to break your soul. They're there to employ somebody. So unless you invite that constructive criticism, generally speaking, they're not going to give it to you. Also looking at pre-interview nerves, and I think this is where a lot of people psych themselves out. I've seen the most confident and the most qualified people fall to water in interview processes purely because of their nerves. And I think it's really important that you are conscious of what happens when you're nervous, whether it be tics that you may start getting. You may be shaking your leg, you may be scratching your ears, you may be twirling your hair, you may be sweating profusely. So you need to notice what you do when you're nervous and really work on lessening their impact, because quite often that tapping leg in an interview can be really distracting, particularly to the panel, not just you. And it's something that will stick in their mind. That is something that they will tag onto you after that process. That was that person that would tap their leg the entire time, or the person that kept brushing their forehead, those sorts of things. So do be mindful of what you do when you're nervous. But there's also a guy that's on the screen at the moment. His name is Dr. Wheel. He is a big advocate for breath exercises, and he borrows a lot from yoga practices as well. He's not a crackpot that's done a 2-week mindfulness course. He is a Harvard professor, and he's still a professor there, so he's done a lot of research. This is something that I've found that's actually worked for me in terms of like sleeping and when I am getting nervous before interviews, or maybe even before big presentations, those sorts of things. It's something that you can do in a waiting room that doesn't stand out, that doesn't make you look strange. No one knows that you're doing it, and it's actually called the natural tranquilizer. So I would actually have a look, even on YouTube. by typing in 478 relaxing breathing exercise, because he's now kind of a big deal. He's been picked up, unfortunately, by Dr. Phil in the last couple of years. And he's a big advocate for him, which is good. It shows that his techniques work. But definitely have a look, because if you are a nervous type of person, it's something that can be worked on, and you can actually become a better interviewee if you're able to manage those anxieties and what you do when you're anxious as well. Like I said, at the end of each one of my workshops, you are welcome to book in appointments with me. I'm not sure what your schedules are like coming towards the end of your placements and the end of your summer semester. I am here. We do have plenty of appointments if you would like to come in and either practice or get some feedback, or if you're really starting to panic about the whole process, you can come in and ask a few questions as well. So a few tips for those online assessment pieces that you will be doing shortly. Really make sure beforehand that you've focused on some examples from lived experience, so from your pracs. You really need to make sure that you've got examples about teamwork skills, about managing time, conflict management potentially, stakeholder engagement, and managing relationships, I think is really important as well. Look, even if Nestlé is not your number one job and you're trying to, a round peg trying to force yourself into a square hole, it's really important that you find something about the organisation that gels with you. So for you, it may be a little bit more difficult to find, I guess, that inspiration as to why you went for the job and those sorts of things, but you really need to make sure that you've done some research to help you better answer the questions that will be expected of you as part of this assignment piece. So make sure you've done your research is probably one of the key things, but also I would suggest going forward, and not just for this assignment, I want you to think about 5 key examples of best practice or good practice or something that you've done well. Because if you have these nailed before any interview process, you can use them pretty much for any question you're ever going to get asked within an interview. So even, and I'm going to take it down to a really basic level, group assignments at university, not too many people like them. There's always clashes of personalities. There's always that one person that may not contribute as much as they should. There's always that one person that tries to dominate and take over. So do be mindful that even those really basic examples of teamwork or group work can actually be used to answer interview questions if you're very, very desperate. Because within that, you're talking about conflict management, playing to people's strengths, being inclusive, delegation of tasks, time management, all those sorts of things as well. So you can actually use those really basic examples to answer a massive range of interview questions. And it's really important that you do focus on having at least 5, because you don't really want to be using the same example to answer 5 or 6 interview questions. You want to be able to give them a diverse range and a diverse experience base that you've had. So do keep that in mind through your current pracs, that you need to be sort of generating and reflecting on key outcomes, key milestones, where you've developed some really key skills as well, because you're actually generating, and I've said it many times before, you're generating content for the actual real recruitment process. So do make sure that you are doing that reflection. It's really, really important that you're actually putting that into, I guess, a STAR formula while you're reflecting on it as well, because you are generating 100% content that you're going to be using within written applications as well as interviews as well. So I'm going to leave it there. If you have any questions in terms of submission for this assignment, please make sure that you email Ali directly for that. If there's any assistance in terms of your performance, your engagement, even how to structure, I guess, some experiences that you're really finding it hard to sort of piece together, come to me, book an appointment. We can even do something over the phone or on Skype if that's something that you want to do, and we can actually help you formulate that sort of the answers for this particular assignment. I think from memory the answers will be released and you'll be given a set amount of time to prepare for them. Please, when you're doing that, do not write a script, because it will sound like a script when you are trying to say it online. Remember that you are supposed to be talking to a person. You need to remember that in real life, these people could potentially be watching 50 of these. You could be number 50 on a Friday afternoon when they want to go home. So you need to make sure that you are engaging, that you're using your body language, and that you are being interesting with the way that you are delivering your information and delivering your answers. So all the best of luck. And last piece of assessment, so you're now well and truly on the downhill to the finishing the subject. And maybe I will see you in appointments soon. All right, bye.